is Nathan, and this happened to me in early 2023 when I was 29 years old. At the time, I worked on the cleaning crew for an administrative building that was part of a large hospital complex on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio. It wasn't the hospital where patients stayed. It was a building used by the human resources, billing, records, and administrative office departments. During the day, hundreds of employees came and went, but after 10 at night, almost everyone left. Only a few security guards remained scattered throughout the complex, along with a small cleaning crew, each person responsible for a different floor. I liked that shift because it paid better, and I almost never had to deal with people. My routine was always the same. I picked up the cleaning cart from the storage room on the ground floor, loaded it with supplies, replaced the trash bags in the offices, mopped the hallways, and finished around 5 in the morning. After a few months, I knew every door, every hallway, and even the normal sounds of that building. Whenever something was out of the ordinary, I noticed it almost immediately. That night, it was very cold outside, and the heating system filled the building with that dry air typical of large office buildings. The silence was so constant that you could hear the faint hum of the LED lights and the distant sound of air moving through the ceiling vents. I was alone on the top floor, listening to music quietly through one earbud while pushing my cleaning cart down the main hallway. It was probably close to 1 in the morning when I finished cleaning a row of offices near the elevator. As I was tying up a trash bag, I heard the familiar chime announcing that the elevator had arrived on my floor. I didn't look up right away because it was common for one of the security guards to make rounds between the buildings. I kept working, expecting to hear footsteps or someone saying hello, but I didn't hear anything at all. A few seconds later, when I finally looked up, I saw the doors still open and the elevator completely empty. I thought it was strange, but I assumed someone had accidentally called it from another floor and taken the stairs before it arrived. The doors closed normally and I went back to work. Less than 5 minutes later, I heard the exact same chime again. The elevator had returned to the top floor. The doors slowly opened, and once again there was no one inside. This time I walked over to the elevator and looked around, as if someone might be playing a prank on me. The display showed that the elevator had come directly from the ground floor. I pressed the button to close the doors and stood there for a few seconds watching the floor numbers count back down. I tried convincing myself it was just some system glitch or a maintenance test, but an uneasy feeling started creeping in. I had worked there for quite a while and had never seen that elevator do the same thing over and over again. A few minutes later, I was on the other side of the floor, cleaning the break room where employees usually ate lunch during the day, when I heard the same elevator chime for the 3rd time. I immediately pulled my earbud out and stood still, listening carefully. I heard no footsteps, no conversation, and no sounds of someone pushing a chair or carrying boxes. Just silence. I walked back into the main hallway and saw the elevator doors open once again. The cab was still empty. By then, it was genuinely starting to bother me. I grabbed the radio the cleaning crew used to communicate with security and called one of the guards asking if anyone was walking around on the top floor. He replied that no one was, that both guards were making rounds outside between the buildings and that nobody had requested access to the floor. I briefly mentioned that the elevator had arrived empty several times. He laughed and said it was probably some employee forgetting to cancel an elevator call from another floor. His explanation made sense, but it didn't explain why no one ever appeared. I decided to finish that hallway as quickly as possible so I could head downstairs. Even though I tried to act normally, I started noticing little things I usually ignored. The reflections of the lights on the polished floor, the echo of my own footsteps, and the sound of my cleaning cart's wheels all seemed much louder than usual. I kept glancing over my shoulder without realizing it, as though I expected to find someone walking a few yards behind me. When I finished that section, I decided to stop by the small monitoring room inside the building. It wasn't the main security office, but it had a computer that allowed access to the interior surveillance cameras on every floor. I used my badge to get inside and started reviewing the footage from the elevator hallway. I simply wanted to confirm that no one had actually stepped out of the elevator. At first, everything looked exactly as I remembered. The doors opened and no one came out. Then I rewound the footage to a few minutes before the first time the elevator reached my floor. I watched a person enter the elevator alone on the ground floor. They were wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled over their head and kept their face lowered the entire time, making it impossible to identify any features. The footage clearly showed them pressing the button for the top floor. I let the recording continue, expecting to see that same person step out when the elevator reached my floor, but it never happened. The elevator opened exactly where I had been working, remained open for a few seconds, then closed again, completely empty. I stared at the monitor, trying to figure out whether I had missed something. I replayed the footage twice. The result was always the same. Someone had entered the elevator, selected my floor, and simply never appeared exiting the cab on the hallway cameras. At that moment, I felt a cold knot in my stomach that I couldn't explain rationally. I spent several seconds staring at the screen, searching for a logical explanation. I thought perhaps the hallway camera had frozen at the exact moment the person stepped out, so I opened another camera positioned farther away, facing the reception area of that floor. The recording was continuous without interruptions and covered almost the entire main hallway. There was nobody there. I picked up my radio again and called security, this time speaking much more seriously. I explained that I had watched someone enter the elevator on the ground floor, but that person never appeared on any camera after the elevator reached the top floor. The guard replied that he would check it out as soon as he finished his outside patrol, but warned me it would still take several minutes because he was on the opposite side of the complex. That made me even more uneasy. For the first time since I started working in that building, I realized that if someone really was hiding somewhere up there, I was completely alone. I closed the monitoring room door and stood there listening. There wasn't a single sound besides the air conditioning. Even so, I decided not to stay put. I took out my phone, slipped it into my pocket already unlocked in case I needed to call 911 quickly, and pushed my cleaning cart back into the hallway. My only intention was to reach the elevator, go down to the ground floor and wait for security there. I no longer cared about finishing my work that night. The moment I stepped out of the monitoring room, I automatically looked toward the elevator. The doors were closed and the display indicated it was still sitting on the top floor. I took a deep breath and began walking down the hallway, keeping my eyes straight ahead. As I rounded a corner where there was a small waiting area with a few chairs and a supply cabinet, something caught my eye. My spare cleaning cart, which I had left there earlier, had been moved a few inches. It wasn't much, but I remembered clearly leaving it pushed tightly against the wall so it wouldn't block the hallway. I stopped immediately. The hallway was completely silent. I took 2 slow steps forward and looked more carefully. That's when I noticed a dark sneaker sticking out from beneath the cart. It wasn't a shadow or a reflection. It was unmistakably someone's foot standing behind it. My entire body froze. At that exact moment, I heard the faint sound of fabric brushing against itself, as though whoever was behind the cart had quietly shifted position after realizing I had seen them. I didn't wait to find out who it was. I slowly backed away without taking my eyes off that spot, and my hands started shaking so badly that I almost dropped the radio. Without thinking, I pressed the emergency button on the radio and spoke with a voice I could barely control. I simply said there was someone hiding on the top floor and that I needed help immediately. The guard answered right away, asking exactly where I was, but I didn't want to keep talking loudly. I was afraid the person behind the cart would come out if they realized I was calling the police. I kept backing away slowly, staring at the cart the entire time. It was tall enough to completely conceal someone crouching behind it. I could only see one foot and every so often a slight movement at the edge, as though the person was adjusting their position. The strangest part was that they didn't try to run or speak to me. They simply stayed hidden. Once I was several yards away, I quickly turned and slipped into the first room I found unlocked. It was a small meeting room used during the day. I quietly shut the door, turned off the light, and stood behind it, trying to steady my breathing. My heart was pounding so loudly that I was convinced anyone outside could hear it. I pressed my ear against the door and remained completely still. For the first few seconds, I heard nothing. Then slow footsteps began crossing the carpeted hallway. They weren't hurried. They sounded like someone walking very slowly, searching for the exact room I had entered. I gripped my phone so tightly that my hands started to ache. I thought about calling 911 directly, but before I could even dial, I heard the guard's voice over the radio, asking if I was still on the channel. I answered in almost a whisper that I was hiding inside a room and begged him not to make any noise when he reached the floor. He simply replied that the police had already been called and that he was entering the building at that very moment. After that, everything became silent again. I kept watching through the small frosted glass window beside the door, but it only gave me a partial view of the hallway. I couldn't see the area where I had left the cart. A few seconds later, a shadow slowly passed across the frosted glass. It stopped directly outside the door. I could make out only the outline of a motionless person. I barely dared to breathe. Then the doorknob slowly turned as though someone was quietly testing whether the door was locked. Fortunately, I had locked it the moment I stepped inside. The handle slowly returned to its normal position, and the person remained standing there for several more seconds. I'll never forget that silence. Whoever was on the other side knew someone was inside the room. I have no idea how long that person remained outside the door. In my mind, it felt like several minutes, but it was probably less than one. Suddenly, I heard the security guard's radio much closer now, loudly announcing that he had reached the top floor. Almost immediately afterward came fast footsteps and voices calling for anyone present to identify themselves. The shadow instantly disappeared from the door. I waited several more seconds before unlocking it, because I was still afraid of opening the door and finding that person waiting for me. When I finally heard the guard knock and call my name, I stepped out of the room, barely able to speak. I quickly explained what had happened and showed him where I had seen someone hiding behind the cleaning cart. When we walked back over, no one was there anymore. The police arrived a few minutes later and searched the entire floor, then the entire building. They found an emergency exit door at the back standing open just wide enough for someone to squeeze through, along with a piece of black fabric caught on the metal push bar, as though someone had rushed out that way. They also reviewed the surveillance footage. They confirmed that someone had indeed entered the elevator on the ground floor, but no one could explain why that person never appeared exiting the elevator in the recordings from the top floor. Even the officers said there was probably some blind spot between the elevator and the hallway, or some kind of camera synchronization issue, but that still didn't explain how the person managed to get so close to me without my noticing. After that night, I took several days off because I simply couldn't bring myself to return to that building. Every time I closed my eyes, I remembered the doorknob slowly turning and that shadow standing silently on the other side of the door. A few weeks later, I heard that another employee had reported finding a man hiding inside an emergency stairwell in another building of the same complex during the night. They never confirmed whether it was the same person, and as far as I know, no one was ever arrested. I requested a transfer to a daytime shift at another location and never worked alone at night again. Even today, whenever I step into an empty elevator, I still remember that recording showing someone pressing the button for my floor and somehow disappearing before ever reaching me. What frightens me most isn't the fact that I saw someone hiding behind the cleaning cart. It's knowing that if I hadn't gone to check the cameras and had simply kept cleaning the hallways like I did every other night, I probably would have walked right past that person without ever realizing they had been watching me for a long time. Story 2. My name is Megan, and this happened to me about 3 years ago when I was 26 years old. At the time, I worked the night shift at a 24-hour laundromat located in an industrial area of Wichita, Kansas. The crowd was very different depending on the time of day. During the daytime, families, students, and people living in apartments without laundry facilities would come in. After 10 at night, it was usually just truck drivers, factory workers getting off their shifts, and a few people who preferred doing their laundry when the place was empty. I worked from 4 in the afternoon until midnight. During the last 30 minutes of my shift, I would already start mopping the floor, emptying the trash cans, and organizing the supplies so I could close everything exactly at midnight. The laundromat was small, with 2 rows of machines, a folding table, a restroom, and a storage room in the back where the cleaning supplies were kept. The entrance had only a single glass door facing the parking lot, and there was no other exit for employees. I had been working there for almost a year and knew practically every customer who came in at night. It was a quiet job, and because of that, I had never been afraid of closing the place by myself. That night was slower than usual. Just before 11:30, the last customers finished folding their clothes and left. As I was wiping down one of the washing machines, I noticed a man sitting alone in the row of chairs at the back of the laundromat. At first, I didn't think anything of it because some people really did sit there while waiting for their laundry cycles to finish. I wished him good evening, but he only looked up for a brief moment and gave me a small wave. I continued tidying up the place for a few minutes before noticing something that caught my attention. Every machine was turned off. None of them were running, and none of them had clothes inside. I walked over to the display panel that showed the active cycles and confirmed that no machines were in use. I looked back at the man. He was still sitting exactly the same way, staring straight ahead as though he were waiting for something. I thought maybe he had arrived early to meet someone or was waiting for a rideshare. Even so, it felt strange that he remained there without any clothes, backpack, or laundry basket nearby. It started making me a little uncomfortable, but I tried convincing myself there had to be a simple explanation. I kept doing my work, but I found myself watching the man more often. Every time I looked up, he was in the exact same position. He wasn't using his phone, reading anything, or looking at the machines. He simply sat there with his elbows resting on his knees and his hands clasped together. The laundromat was brightly lit, but he was sitting in the farthest corner of the room, where the lighting seemed a little dimmer. I couldn't make out many details of his face, only that he was wearing a dark baseball cap and a light jacket, even though it was a relatively warm night. About 15 minutes before midnight, I walked over to him and politely told him that the laundromat would be closing soon. He looked at me for a few seconds before replying that he was still waiting for it to finish. That answer left me confused. I asked which machine was his, and he vaguely pointed toward the row of washers without indicating any specific one. I looked in the direction he pointed and confirmed once again that every machine was turned off. When I looked back at him, he had already lowered his head again as if the conversation were over. I decided not to press the issue. I thought maybe he was tired, distracted, or even dealing with some mental health issue. I simply told him that I would need to close the store in a few minutes and return to the counter, but his answer kept bothering me. When the clock struck midnight, I began my closing routine. First, I turned off half of the lights, leaving only the entrance and counter lights on. Then I locked the change machine and balanced the cash register. Before switching off the remaining lights, I looked toward the back of the laundromat again. The chair where the man had been sitting was empty. My first reaction was to look toward the glass entrance, assuming he had left while I was counting the register, but the bell mounted above the door hadn't rung. It always made a loud sound whenever someone entered or exited, specifically so whoever was behind the counter would know. Besides that, from where I was standing, I had a clear view of the laundromat's only exit almost the entire time. I walked over to the row of chairs thinking perhaps he had gone to the restroom. The restroom door was open and the light was off. No one was inside. I quickly scanned the entire laundromat, between the machines, behind the folding tables, and near the dryers. The place was small enough that you could see from one end to the other. Even so, the man had simply vanished. At that moment, I felt that uneasy sensation that comes when something doesn't make sense, but I still tried to rationalize it. I thought maybe I had been distracted for a few seconds while balancing the register, and somehow hadn't heard the bell. It was the only explanation I could come up with. I took a deep breath and tried to put it out of my mind. I still needed to put away the cleaning supplies and quickly mop the storage room before leaving. I grabbed the keys from behind the counter and walked toward the back of the laundromat. The storage room was a small space with shelves full of detergent, trash bags, and boxes of soap. The lighting there was dimmer than in the rest of the laundromat, using only an old fluorescent bulb that took a few seconds to fully light up. I stepped inside, set the bucket on the floor, and began putting away the bottles I had used throughout the night. The storage room door normally stayed open because it didn't have an automatic latch. As I organized the supplies, I heard the bell above the front door ring once. It made me stop immediately. I assumed a customer had walked in at the last minute. I even leaned my head out of the storage room to tell them the laundromat was already closed, but before I could take a step, I heard another sound. It was the storage room door slowly moving behind me. I turned around immediately and saw it slowly swinging shut, as though someone were pushing it from the outside. At first, I thought it might be a draft, but the door continued moving steadily until it was almost against the frame. I ran over and grabbed the doorknob before it could close completely. The moment I pulled on the door, I felt resistance from the other side. It wasn't strong enough to rip it out of my hands, but someone was clearly holding it shut. My stomach dropped instantly. I shoved harder and heard the faint scrape of a shoe against the laundromat floor, as though the person on the other side had shifted their footing to keep the door closed. I didn't hear a single word, no heavy breathing and no threats. Just that strange silence and the steady pressure against the door. I yelled, demanding to know who was there, and said I was calling the police. There was no response. I kept pushing with all my strength while my heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. Then, all at once, the pressure disappeared. The door flew open so suddenly that I nearly lost my balance. I rushed out of the storage room, looking in every direction. The laundromat was empty. The lights I had left on still illuminated the entrance, and the glass door remained closed exactly as before. There was no one between the machines, near the restroom, or behind the folding tables. Even so, I was absolutely certain that someone had just been holding that door shut from the outside. I stood there for several seconds trying to decide what to do. My first instinct was to call the owner of the laundromat, but I almost immediately gave up on that idea because he lived more than 30 minutes away. Instead, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 while backing toward the counter without taking my eyes off the rest of the laundromat. I explained that I believed someone was hiding somewhere inside the building. The dispatcher instructed me to stay on the line and wait for the police to arrive. As I spoke with her, I heard a metallic sound coming from the back of the laundromat. One of the dryer doors had slowly swung shut. I turned toward the sound but didn't see anyone. A moment later, another noise caught my attention. A rolling laundry cart had moved a few inches across the floor, as though someone had just pushed it. That was enough for me to stop trying to figure out what was happening. I grabbed my keys, unlocked the front door, and stepped out into the parking lot without looking back. I stayed outside near my car while the dispatcher continued talking to me. From there, I could see most of the laundromat through the glass front. The lights were still on, but I couldn't see anyone moving around inside. A patrol car arrived just a few minutes later. 2 officers entered the laundromat while another stayed outside with me, asking questions about the man I had seen sitting in the back earlier that night. They checked the restroom, the storage room, every machine, and even the space behind the dryers. They found no one. They also quickly reviewed the footage from the interior security cameras. That's when they discovered something that still unsettles me to this day. The recordings clearly showed the man sitting in the back of the laundromat for quite a while. After I began closing the register, he stood up and walked toward an area that was outside the view of one of the cameras behind a row of dryers. A few minutes later, I appeared entering the storage room. Then the footage showed only the storage room door slowly closing by itself, because whoever was pushing it remained in the blind spot between 2 cameras. Moments later, as I ran out of the storage room, the man calmly walked to the front door and left the laundromat just seconds before the police arrived. They never identified him. I quit that job later that same week. What scares me most when I think back to that night isn't knowing that he stayed hidden inside the laundromat. It's realizing that while I was struggling to open the storage room door, believing it had somehow gotten stuck, someone was standing on the other side, silently forcing it shut to keep me trapped inside. Story 3. My name is Alex Mercer, and this happened to me in late 2022 when I was 31 years old. At the time, I worked the overnight shift at a large distribution center on the outskirts of Indianapolis, Indiana. The warehouse was enormous, the kind used by logistics companies to sort packages before shipping them to other states. During the day, hundreds of employees moved between the conveyor belts and storage racks, but after midnight, almost everything operated automatically. My job was to monitor the conveyor belts from the control room, clear minor jams, and make inspection rounds whenever a sensor reported a malfunction. For most of the night, I worked completely alone in that section of the building. There was only one security guard outside, and a few operators in another area separated by a long hallway that I rarely had to cross. I liked the job because it was quiet. I spent hours listening only to the constant hum of the conveyor motors, the barcode scanners, and the industrial fans mounted throughout the ceiling. After a few months, I knew the building perfectly and had developed an almost automatic routine. I knew which sounds were normal and which ones meant something was wrong. That's why, when what I'm about to describe happened, I immediately realized that something wasn't right. That night was unfolding exactly as usual. I had already cleared a small jam on one of the conveyor belts around 1 in the morning and had returned to the control room, filling out a report on the computer. The clock showed a few minutes past 2 when the building's PA system made the familiar click that always came just before an announcement. I assumed it was either a routine test or a message from the security team. Then I heard a calm male voice say only, "Alex, go to Sector C14. Nothing else. The transmission ended immediately. I sat there for a few seconds staring at the ceiling, trying to process what I had just heard. Sector C14 was one of the most isolated parts of the warehouse, where tall storage racks held merchandise waiting to be loaded onto trucks. At that hour, no one should have been working there. Besides that, every internal announcement normally began by explaining the reason for the call and identifying who was making it. That voice had simply spoken my first name and directed me to a location. I wondered if it was a supervisor trying to reach me, but something about the way the message had been delivered made me uncomfortable. It was so direct, without any explanation, as if whoever had spoken knew I would recognize my own name and simply obey. I remained seated for a few moments, trying to decide whether it had been some kind of prank. I picked up my radio and called the shift supervisor, asking whether anyone had made an announcement over the PA system. It took him a few seconds to answer. He said he was in another building within the complex dealing with an issue involving a truck and asked what I was talking about. I explained exactly what I had heard. He went silent for a moment before telling me that no one from management had used the speakers that night. He also mentioned that broadcasting a message required access to a specific computer inside the administrative office, which remained locked throughout the night. That only deepened my confusion. I thought perhaps someone from maintenance was testing the system, but those tests were always announced in advance. I looked back at the conveyor belt monitors. Everything was running normally. No sensors were reporting a problem in Sector C14 or anywhere else in the warehouse. Even so, out of curiosity, I decided to check that aisle before returning to the control room. I grabbed a flashlight since some areas between the storage racks were a little darker, and started walking the same route I followed almost every night. It took a few minutes to reach Sector C14. The farther I walked, the more distant the sound of the conveyor belts became. In that section of the warehouse, the only noise came from the constant ventilation system and the electric forklifts charging their batteries in a closed-off area nearby. The metal racks stretched several stories high, creating long aisles where it was impossible to see from one end to the other. When I finally reached the sector mentioned in the announcement, I found exactly what I expected. Nothing. No employees, no forklifts running, and no pallets being moved. I swept my flashlight across the rack labels, quickly checked behind a few pallets, and stood there for about a minute. The place was completely empty. The strange feeling began to fade, and I convinced myself that someone had probably made a mistake with the PA system. Before heading back, I decided to log the incident in the control room computer so the morning staff could check it later. At that point, I had no idea that the most disturbing part of the night wasn't the announcement that had brought me there, but the fact that someone apparently knew exactly where I would go after hearing it. I returned to the control room and went straight to the computer that logged all activity on the internal system. Besides monitoring the conveyor belts, the program also stored a history of every announcement made through the PA system, recording the time, the terminal used, and the operator responsible. I expected to find a message logged at 2 o'clock in the morning. I opened the report and searched for the exact time. There was absolutely nothing. The last recorded announcement had been almost 4 hours earlier, when management informed everyone about a delayed truck arriving. I refreshed the screen, assuming the system might simply be slow to synchronize. The result stayed the same. I ran the same search on another computer in the control room and found exactly the same history. No transmission, no error, and no record of anyone accessing the system at that time. I started feeling that familiar uneasiness that comes when a situation stops looking like a simple technical problem. I called the supervisor again and told him what I had found. He replied that he would finish dealing with the truck in a few minutes and come to the warehouse to check everything with me. He asked me to stay in the control room until he arrived. I agreed, but before sitting down, I decided to make one last quick inspection of a nearby aisle, because one of the motion sensors had briefly fluctuated on the control panel. That happened from time to time, and usually all it took was checking whether a box had been left in the wrong position. I walked down the central aisle, lighting the way with my flashlight even though the overhead lights were still on. As I moved between the towering racks, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I didn't hear footsteps or any unusual sounds. It was simply that hard-to-explain instinct that makes you glance over your shoulder without realizing it. I stopped for a moment and swept the flashlight down the side aisles. Everything looked normal. Just as I turned back toward the main aisle, I caught a quick movement at the far end of one row of racks. Instinctively, I aimed the light in that direction. Between two stacked pallets, I could make out part of a man's body standing perfectly still. He was positioned so that only half of his face and one shoulder were visible between the freight. The moment my flashlight hit him, he didn't run or try to hide any further. He simply kept staring directly at me. The detail that made my entire body go cold was realizing where he was standing. It wasn't some random corner of the warehouse. It was right beside the aisle I walked through every single night during my inspections. From where he was hidden, he could quietly watch my entire route without being seen by anyone passing through. My first instinct was to take 2 slow steps backward without taking my eyes off him. I gripped my radio so tightly I could barely feel my fingers and immediately called security. I tried to keep my voice steady as I reported that I had found a man hiding between the storage racks. The security guard answered that he was already entering the warehouse and instructed me not to approach the man. I continued watching that direction for several more seconds. The man remained completely motionless. He made no gestures, said nothing, and didn't seem at all concerned that he had been spotted. That was exactly what frightened me the most. Slowly, I backed away down the aisle without ever turning my back to him. When I reached the end of the row of racks, I lost sight of him for just a moment. I kept retreating until I reached a wider aisle. As soon as I reached a position where I felt slightly safer, I aimed my flashlight back toward the place where he had been standing. He was gone. I ran to the control room and locked the door behind me. From there, I could monitor part of the warehouse through the security cameras. I quickly cycled through the video feeds, trying to locate the man, but the towering racks created numerous blind spots. As I reviewed the monitors, I noticed something that made me even more nervous. 2 different cameras showed the same figure slowly walking through the aisles just minutes before I received the announcement over the PA system. In every clip, he was moving in the direction of the exact route I normally followed during my inspections. The supervisor and the police arrived shortly afterward and conducted a complete search of the building. They found a side-loading door that had been forced open from the outside. They also discovered fresh shoe prints in an area where no one normally went during the overnight shift. Even so, they found no one inside the warehouse. Before leaving, one of the officers reviewed the security footage with me and asked whether I always followed the same inspection route. I told him I did. I practically walked the same path at the same times every night because it was the fastest way to check the sensors. He stared at the footage for a few seconds before saying something I have never forgotten. He remarked that whoever had been hiding there seemed to know exactly when and where I would pass by. A few days later, the company changed the warehouse access points, reinforced security, and completely redesigned the inspection routes so no one would follow the same path every night. I continued working there for a few more months, but I never again managed to make those inspections without constantly looking toward the end of every aisle between the storage racks. What still unsettles me when I think back to that night isn't the voice calling my name over the PA system. It's the thought that it may have been nothing more than a way to lure me to the exact place where someone was already waiting to watch my reaction. Story 4. My name is Ryan Holloway, and this happened to me in the winter of 2024 when I was 38 years old. At the time, I worked as a night security guard at a repair shop specializing in the maintenance of ambulances and other emergency vehicles on the outskirts of Billings, Montana. The shop serviced hospitals, fire departments, and private rescue services from several towns throughout the region. During the day, the place was busy, full of mechanics, drivers, and suppliers coming and going. After 7 in the evening, everyone left and the building became practically empty. My job was to patrol the yard, make sure the gates stayed locked, check that no alarms had gone off, and complete a report before the morning shift arrived. I worked alone almost every night. The main office was located at the front of the building, while the repair bay and the yard where the ambulances were parked occupied a large area in the back. I knew every corner of that place. I knew exactly how many vehicles were parked there each night, and I always checked the keys before starting my patrols. It was a quiet job, and because of that, any unusual detail immediately caught my attention. It was extremely cold that night. The temperature was below freezing, and a thin layer of ice covered parts of the yard. The wind occasionally made the metal fence panels vibrate, but aside from that, the place was completely silent. A little after 1 in the morning, I finished checking the security cameras and grabbed my flashlight to begin the exterior inspection. Before heading outside, I stopped by the keyboard, where the keys to the ambulances being serviced were kept. It was a habit I had every night. I checked quickly and every key was still hanging there. I locked the office behind me and started walking through the yard, shining my flashlight over the parked vehicles. As soon as I rounded the corner of the repair bay, I stopped in my tracks. An ambulance was parked near the back gate in a spot where I was absolutely certain there hadn't been any vehicle about half an hour earlier. Its headlights were off, the engine wasn't running, and none of the emergency lights were activated. I stood there for several seconds, unable to understand how that was possible. The first thought that crossed my mind was that one of the mechanics had returned to leave the vehicle there, but I had just checked the keys myself, and every one of them was still inside the office. I walked a few steps toward the ambulance without taking my eyes off it. The yard was so quiet that I could hear my boots crunching through the thin layer of ice covering the ground. I shined my flashlight through the cab and saw no one in either the driver's seat or the passenger seat. The windows were fogged because of the cold, so I moved closer, trying to get a better look inside. Nothing. I slowly walked around the side of the vehicle, assuming a driver might be filling out paperwork or checking medical supplies in the rear compartment. As I approached, I caught a faint smell of diesel, as if the engine had been shut off only a short time earlier. That made me even more confused. If someone had just parked it there, how had they gotten into the facility without taking the keys? When I reached the rear doors, I heard a faint metallic sound. I stopped immediately. Both rear doors were only partially closed. The next moment, they began to close very slowly, as though someone inside was gently pulling them shut. They didn't slam all at once. They slowly moved closer until they were almost closed. Through the narrow opening, I caught sight of a hand gripping one of the inside handles. I immediately stepped back. Whoever was inside clearly knew I had arrived. I kept staring at the back of the ambulance, expecting whoever was inside to come out or say something. Nothing happened. The doors finished closing completely, and silence returned. I grabbed the radio clip to my belt and began calling the monitoring company that handled security for the shop. Before anyone answered, I heard another sound coming from a completely different direction. It was the faint click of the front office door handle. Instinctively, I turned and pointed my flashlight toward the building entrance. A man wearing a dark jacket was carefully trying to open the glass office door, as though he believed I was still distracted by the ambulance. The instant my flashlight hit his face, he immediately let go of the handle. My stomach dropped. That was when I realized there were at least 2 people in the yard. While one remained hidden inside the ambulance to keep my attention focused there, the other was using those few seconds to quietly try to break into the office. I didn't hesitate. I ran behind one of the parked trucks because from there I could keep both the ambulance and the office entrance in view without exposing myself completely. Crouched behind the truck, I finally managed to reach the monitoring center over the radio. I quickly explained that there were at least 2 people inside the yard and asked them to call the police immediately. The dispatcher instructed me not to confront anyone and to remain in a safe location until the patrol units arrived. As she spoke, I kept watching the front entrance of the building. The man I had illuminated moments earlier stood still for a few seconds, looking around as though trying to figure out where I had hidden. Then he slowly walked along the side of the building and disappeared from my line of sight. My fear was that he would circle around the repair bay looking for me. After waiting a few moments, I looked back toward the ambulance. The rear doors were still closed. Suddenly, I heard a faint metallic click, and one of the doors opened just a few inches. Not enough for someone to step out, just enough for a person to discreetly look outside. I saw part of a face watching the direction of the office. As soon as my flashlight swept near it, the door slowly closed again. That confirmed there really had been someone hiding inside the entire time. I began to realize that the two men seemed to be communicating only through their movements, deliberately avoiding making any noise that might attract attention. Less than 5 minutes later, though it felt much longer to me, I heard the distant sound of sirens approaching along the road. As soon as the noise became more noticeable, everything changed very quickly. The man inside the ambulance suddenly threw the rear door open and sprinted toward the back wall. At almost the exact same moment, the other man reappeared near the office and also took off running, heading toward the opposite side of the yard. I remained hidden, exactly as the monitoring center had instructed. The police arrived seconds later and entered through the main gate while I pointed toward the two directions the men had fled. One of them managed to escape by crossing an empty lot behind the repair shop. The other disappeared among several parked trucks at a neighboring business before the officers could catch him. When we returned to inspect the ambulance, we found one of the side windows had been forced open, and several interior compartments had been left open, as though someone had been searching for equipment or medication. The strangest discovery came afterward. No one could explain where the vehicle had come from. The ambulance didn't belong to the repair shop. It had been stolen from a nearby town just a few hours earlier. To this day, I still think that if I had walked straight to the back of that ambulance and opened those doors without realizing what was happening around me, the other man probably would have gotten into the office without me ever noticing he was there. Story 5. My name is Caleb, and this happened to me at the beginning of 2023 when I was 34 years old. At the time, I worked as an electrical maintenance technician for a company contracted by several commercial buildings in Charlotte, North Carolina. Most of our work had to be done during the night because shutting off the power to an entire floor during business hours would disrupt hundreds of employees. That week, I had been assigned to a 15-story office building where several electrical panels were being replaced, and the emergency lighting system was scheduled for inspection. I was working alone because that night's job was relatively simple. The security guard remained on the ground floor controlling access to the building, while I moved through the upper floors carrying out the repairs. The building was completely empty after 8 in the evening. All the offices were locked, the elevators were operating normally, and only a few emergency lights remained on in the hallways. It was close to 1 in the morning when I went up to the 13th floor to shut off part of the power and begin the final stage of the job. I had worked in that building several times before and knew it well, so there was nothing that concerned me when I stepped into that hallway. The 13th floor was occupied by a financial consulting company. During the day, the hallway was always full of people coming in and out of meeting rooms, but that night it was completely silent. The only sound was the constant hum of the ventilation system. I walked to the electrical panel located near the elevators, checked the work order, and shut off the circuit that supplied power to almost the entire hallway. As soon as I did, nearly all the lights went out exactly as expected, nearly all of them. At the far end of the floor, one office remained fully illuminated. Through the glass wall, I could clearly see that the lights inside that office were still on while the rest of the hallway was left in near darkness. My first thought was that the room must have been connected to a different electrical circuit. That happened in some buildings to keep important equipment running. Even so, it struck me as odd because, according to the electrical blueprint I was carrying, that office belonged to the very circuit I had just shut off. I grabbed my flashlight, checked the panel again to make sure I had switched off the correct breaker, and started walking toward the illuminated office to find out what was going on. As I walked down the hallway, the single-lit office looked even more out of place. Every other glass door reflected only the dim glow of the emergency lighting, while that one remained brightly lit, as though someone were still working inside. When I got closer, I looked through the glass, expecting to find an employee who had stayed late. The office was empty. There were only neatly arranged desks, powered-off monitors, a few chairs pushed under the workstations, and a coffee mug left on one of the desks. There wasn't a single computer running, no television, and no equipment that could explain the brightness. The light was coming directly from the ceiling fixtures, which were operating normally. I tested the light switch beside the door, but it did absolutely nothing. I stepped into the office thinking there might be an independent circuit hidden above the ceiling tiles. I spent a few minutes quickly checking the secondary electrical panel and found nothing unusual. Everything indicated that those lights simply should not have been on. I decided to leave that inspection for later and returned to the main panel where I could study the electrical blueprint more carefully. As soon as I stepped out of the office, I had taken only 3 or 4 steps down the hallway when I heard a sharp crack coming from the ceiling. At that exact moment, every light that was still on throughout the floor went out simultaneously. The only illumination left was my flashlight. The hallway became much darker than before. I stopped immediately and pointed the flashlight ahead, trying to understand what had happened. Then, for a brief moment, I noticed a reflection in the large windows overlooking the outside of the building. Instead of looking directly behind me, my eyes caught that dark reflection in the glass first. A person was standing several feet behind me. They remained completely motionless, holding something long alongside their body. It took me a second to realize it looked like a metal bar, similar to the ones used by maintenance technicians. My body reacted before my mind did. I started turning around quickly, but before I completed the movement, a chill ran down my spine. When I finally looked behind me, the hallway was empty. There was no one there. Even so, I was absolutely certain that the reflection I had seen couldn't have been mistaken for a shadow or my own body. The image had remained visible long enough for me to clearly distinguish a person standing exactly where I had just walked past. I stood there trying to steady my breathing and convince myself that it could have been some kind of reflection caused by my flashlight hitting the glass. Even so, my instincts told me to get off that floor immediately. I picked up my radio and called the security guard stationed in the lobby. I asked if anyone else had entered the building after I went upstairs. He said no. According to the access log, only my badge had been used and no one had entered through the front desk since the start of my shift. I briefly told him about the blackout and said I thought I had seen someone in the hallway. He asked if I wanted him to come upstairs and check with me. I said yes and started walking back toward the elevators. I avoided looking directly behind me. Instead, every few steps I watched the reflections in the windows. The hallway was long and lined with glass along one side, so any movement would have been easy to spot in the reflections. I kept walking slowly, shining my flashlight on every door, every office, and every corner where someone might have been hiding. I found absolutely no one. Even so, the feeling that I wasn't alone only grew stronger. It was the kind of sensation that's difficult to explain, the feeling that someone is watching you even though you can't tell from where. I was only a few yards away from the electrical panel when I heard a metallic sound behind me. It wasn't loud. It sounded like an iron bar lightly touching the floor. I immediately swung my flashlight in that direction. Once again, no one was there. But this time I noticed something else. A fire door near the end of the hallway was still gently swaying, as though it had just been pushed open. I had walked past it less than a minute earlier, and I clearly remembered it being completely closed. I shined my flashlight on it and watched as the movement gradually slowed until it stopped completely. Just then, my radio came to life again. The security guard said he had just stepped out of the elevator and was entering the hallway on the 13th floor. I told him not to turn off his flashlight and to come straight toward me. While I waited, I kept my eyes fixed on the fire door. I didn't have the courage to go through it alone. The only thing running through my mind was that if someone really was hiding on that floor, they knew the building much better than I did, and were somehow managing to stay one step ahead of me the entire time. The security guard arrived less than a minute later. I told him everything that had happened starting from the moment I found the illuminated office. Together, we returned to the room to check it again. As soon as we walked in, the lights that had previously remained on were now off like every other office on the floor. We checked the switches, opened the room's small electrical panel, and found nothing out of the ordinary. Then we searched the rest of the floor together. We opened meeting rooms, storage closets, restrooms, and even the maintenance cabinets. There was no one anywhere. When we reached the fire door I had seen moving, we found a service stairwell connecting every floor of the building. We went down several flights, shining our flashlights across each landing, but we didn't see anyone there either. The security guard decided to review the security camera footage while I stayed with him. The recordings showed me walking alone through the hallway the entire time. The problem was that the exact section where I had seen the reflection in the windows wasn't covered by any camera. There was a small blind spot between two cameras because of the layout of the glass walls. That explained why no one appeared in the footage, but it didn't answer who could have been there or how they had disappeared so quickly. The following day, I spoke with the building manager and told him everything that had happened. He requested a full inspection of the lighting system, as well as the access records from that night. No keycard other than mine and the security guards had been used after the building closed. A few weeks later, I learned that a contractor had discovered signs that someone had been accessing the emergency stairwell through a side door that hadn't been latching properly for months. They never found out who it was or how long it had been happening. Whenever I think back to that night, what bothers me the most isn't the office that remained illuminated after I shut off the power. It's the image I saw reflected in the window. If I had looked directly behind me instead of noticing the reflection first, I might never have realized that person was there. And when I think about it now, there's one possibility that still makes me uneasy. Maybe they disappeared only because they realized I already knew they were standing there, holding that metal bar, just a few feet behind my back. Story 6. My name is Brandon Hayes. I was 30 years old when this happened to me. At the time, I worked the overnight shift at a large refrigerated food distribution center on the outskirts of Des Moines, Iowa. The facility supplied supermarkets, restaurants, and hospitals throughout the region. During the day, forklifts were constantly moving around, trucks arrived non-stop, and dozens of employees organized merchandise. After midnight, activity slowed down considerably. Only a few truck drivers waiting for shipments in another area of the complex, and a handful of warehouse workers preparing orders scheduled to leave before dawn, remained on site. That week, I was covering a coworker's vacation and had been assigned to handle the refrigerated products section by myself. Most of my time was spent going in and out of a massive walk-in freezer to sort boxes of dairy products, packaged meats, and other goods that had to be kept at low temperatures. I was already used to that environment. I knew exactly how long I could stay inside before needing to step out to warm up, and I always carried a radio clipped to my jacket in case of an emergency. I had never had any problems at that job, and that was exactly why that night started like any other. It was just after 2 in the morning when I entered the freezer again to organize a pallet of boxes that had arrived at the end of the previous shift. As soon as the heavy metal door closed behind me, the familiar silence of that place took over. Inside, all you could hear was the constant hum of the refrigeration fans and the occasional creak of the metal shelving whenever I pushed a load. The temperature stayed well below zero, so I always worked wearing thick gloves, a knit cap, and a thermal jacket provided by the company. I was finishing the last few boxes when I heard 3 loud knocks on the freezer door. They sounded like someone was knocking with their knuckles or with some kind of metal object. I assumed it was another employee needing to come in, so I called out that I was on my way to open the door. I walked over, unlocked the inside handle, and stepped into the refrigerated hallway that connected the different storage rooms. There was no one there. I looked both ways expecting to see a forklift or at least hear footsteps fading away, but the hallway was completely empty. The bright white lights made everything easy to see, and I could look a long way in either direction. Even so, there wasn't a single sign of anyone. I figured a coworker had knocked on the wrong door by mistake or was pulling some pointless prank. I shook my head, went back inside the freezer, and continued working. I went back to stacking boxes, trying to forget about it. I even considered calling someone on the radio to ask who had been there, but I decided against it because I thought I'd sound ridiculous. A few minutes later, I heard the knocking again. This time it was faster, 5 or 6 knocks in quick succession, as if someone were in a hurry for me to open the door. I set down the box I was carrying and walked straight to the exit. Before opening it, I stood there for a few seconds waiting to hear someone's voice outside. I heard nothing. I pulled the door open and shined the flashlight attached to my vest down the hallway. It was still completely empty. The silence was so deep that I could hear only the compressor running somewhere else in the warehouse. I began to feel uneasy. That section wasn't open to the public, and very few people were authorized to be there during the night. Besides, if someone needed to talk to me, they normally used the radio instead of knocking on the freezer door. I picked up the radio, clipped to my shoulder, and asked if anyone had been in the hallway by the freezer rooms. 2 coworkers answered almost at the same time, saying they were in the loading area on the opposite side of the warehouse, and asked why I wanted to know. I simply replied that I thought I'd heard someone calling me and ended the conversation. I didn't want to worry anyone over something that might have had a perfectly simple explanation. I went back inside the freezer and left the door only slightly ajar while I reorganized the last few boxes. I was still thinking about the knocking when I heard a metallic slam so loud that I nearly knocked over the pallet. The door had just slammed shut behind me. I immediately ran to it and tried to open it. The inside handle turned normally, but the door wouldn't move even an inch. I pushed harder, thinking the mechanism had jammed because of the impact, but it remained completely stuck. At that moment, I felt a cold that had nothing to do with the freezer. It was the kind of cold that comes from panic. I grabbed my radio and started calling anyone on the team. Before anyone answered, I heard footsteps outside. They were slow, heavy footsteps, pacing back and forth directly in front of the door. I pounded on the steel door and shouted that it was jammed. The footsteps stopped for a few seconds. Then I heard the outside handle slowly being pushed down. It wasn't an attempt to open the door. It sounded like someone was simply testing the handle, letting it go, then a few seconds later doing exactly the same thing again. I stood there silently for a moment, listening. Whoever was outside clearly knew I was trapped inside. I called over the radio again, this time much louder. My voice shook because I could already feel the cold creeping through my gloves and making my fingers stiff. One of the warehouse operators answered and asked what was happening. I quickly explained that the freezer door wouldn't open and asked someone to come to the section immediately. He said he was leaving the loading area, but would need a few minutes because he had to cross almost the entire warehouse. As soon as I finished speaking, the footsteps started again. This time they were even slower. I could follow the sound as they moved back and forth outside the door. At times it sounded as though the person walked several feet away before returning. Once again, I heard the handle being pressed down slowly, as though someone were checking whether I was still trying to open the door. I slammed my fist against the door and shouted that help was already on the way. There was no response. Just silence for a few seconds. Then I heard the faint scrape of a shoe sliding across the concrete floor. That frightened me more than if the person had actually spoken. Whoever was on the other side seemed completely calm. They showed no urgency, no nervousness, and no intention of opening the door. I quickly looked around for another way out, even though I already knew there wasn't one. The freezer was large, filled with metal shelves and pallets stacked almost to the ceiling, but it had only one entrance. The temperature display showed several degrees below zero, and I started to notice my fingers becoming less responsive despite the insulated gloves. I kept rubbing my hands together while holding the radio close to my mouth so I wouldn't lose contact with the rest of the team. Then I heard another sound outside. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. It sounded like someone was resting something metallic against the door. A faint scrape, followed by another slow test of the handle. At that moment, a possibility crossed my mind that made my stomach turn. The person outside might not have been trying to get in. Maybe they were simply checking that the door remained shut, waiting for the cold to do what they didn't need to do themselves. I had never felt so vulnerable in my life, trapped behind that steel door with no way of seeing who was pacing on the other side. The next few minutes felt much longer than they really were. I kept talking over the radio so my co-workers would know I was still conscious. At one point, I heard a forklift operating in the distance, followed shortly afterward by voices echoing through the hallway. Almost at the same moment, the footsteps outside the door stopped completely. I pounded on the steel door with all the strength I had left and shouted again. A few seconds later, I heard someone trying to open the door from the outside. This time, the handle turned firmly, and I heard a co-worker asking if I was okay. As soon as he pulled the door, it opened immediately without any resistance. I stumbled out of the freezer, my face burning from the sudden change in temperature. 3 employees were standing in the hallway, but none of them had seen anyone there. One of them said that as they approached the section, they thought it was strange to find the hallway completely empty because they could still hear me banging on the door while they were running toward me. We quickly searched the nearby areas and found only an abandoned transport cart near a service exit. The rear access door was slightly open, even though it was normally kept locked throughout the night. Later, the supervisor reviewed the security camera footage from that hallway. One of the cameras showed a man wearing a dark jacket slowly walking toward the freezer rooms just a few minutes before I became trapped. The next camera, which covered the exact front of the freezer where I was working, had been temporarily out of service because it had been waiting for maintenance for several days. A few minutes later, another camera captured the same man leaving the hallway through the service exit just before my co-workers arrived to let me out. They never identified him. The police believed he had most likely entered the warehouse by slipping in with a truck during a nighttime delivery. But no one could explain why he chose that particular freezer, or why he stayed pacing outside while I was trying to get out. I continued working at that distribution center for a few more months, but I never again entered a walk-in freezer by myself. To this day, whenever I think back to that night, what unsettles me the most isn't the fact that someone locked the door. It's remembering those slow footsteps pacing back and forth on the other side, as though that person was simply waiting to see how long I could survive before someone realized I had disappeared.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.